Hey everyone, I don't know why I'm even typing this out, but I guess I just need to vent and maybe hear from someone who's been in my shoes. My name's Timothy, I'm 35, and I've been married to Candy for 5 years. She's beautiful, outgoing, and the type of person who lights up every room she walks into. Or at least, that's what I thought. Last week, I was packing for a work trip when I noticed something strange. Candy had left her laundry basket in the corner of our bedroom, and right on top was her favorite blouse. I was folding some of her clothes to be nice and noticed these odd hardened stains on the fabric. They were crusty and just off. I asked her about it casually, and her reaction hit me like a punch to the gut. She laughed it off but avoided eye contact, saying it was just food from a work lunch. Jake probably spilled something on me, she said, mentioning her boss like it was no big deal. But it felt off. Too quick. Too dismissive. The thing is, Jake and Candy always seemed too close. I never said much about it because I trusted her. But now, I started noticing other things. The late nights at work. The sudden interest in looking her absolute best, even when we were just hanging around the house. The way she'd guard her phone like it held state secrets. I don't know what's worse, feeling paranoid or realizing you're not paranoid enough. So, here's where I did something I never thought I'd have to do in my marriage. I took precautions. My gut told me not to confront her without proof. Before heading out for my work trip, I met with a lawyer. He explained my options and what I should do if my suspicions turned out to be true. I hired a private investigator too. Yeah, I know, it sounds extreme. But something in my gut was screaming that I needed to know the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. A couple of days later, I was halfway across the country for a conference when my phone buzzed. It was an email from the PI. We need to talk. I have photos you need to see. My stomach dropped. I locked myself in the hotel bathroom and called him. That's when my worst fears became a reality. Sat there in the hotel bathroom, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The PI's voice on the other end of the line was calm, but his words hit me like a train. I have photographic evidence, he said. Your wife was at a party this past weekend. She wasn't alone. The word party caught me off guard. Candy had told me she was visiting her friend Sandra that night. Just a casual girls' night to catch up. Nothing unusual, or so I thought. I asked the PI what he meant, and his answer made my skin crawl. She was with Jake, her boss, and several other men. I'm sending the photos to your email now. I barely managed to hang up before rushing to my laptop. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely type my password. When I finally opened the email, the images loaded, and my entire world shattered. The first photo showed Candy standing in the middle of a crowded room, holding a drink and laughing. Jake had his arm around her waist, way too familiar for a work relationship. The next few photos were worse, intimate moments, stolen glances, and then her with multiple men. It was explicit, something I never imagined I'd see in my life, let alone involving the woman I loved. There was one photo I couldn't stop staring at. Jake and Candy, in a private corner of the room, completely entangled. The look on her face wasn't one of discomfort or reluctance. She looked happy, like she was exactly where she wanted to be. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the screen. Minutes? Hours? Time didn't seem to exist. All I could think about was how I'd trusted her. I'd given her everything, my heart, my loyalty, my life, and this was how she repaid me. I thought about calling her right then and there, but what would I even say? I was too angry to form words. Too heartbroken to think straight. So instead, I called the PI back and asked for more details. Who else was at the party? How long had this been going on? The answers weren't any easier to hear. From what I've gathered, the PI said, this wasn't a one-time thing. Your wife has been seeing Jake for a while. The other men? That seems to be a more recent development. Hearing those words out loud made me feel physically sick. I had to hang up before I lost it completely. Sitting there in that cold, sterile hotel room, I realized something that scared me more than anything else. I didn't know Candy at all. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pictures. Candy smiling, laughing, acting like the life we built together didn't even exist. My stomach churned just thinking about it. By morning, I had convinced myself I needed to confront her. But the rational part of me, the part that still wanted answers, held me back. Instead, I decided to call her and see if she'd slip up. When she answered, her voice was cheerful, almost too cheerful. Hey babe. How's the conference? Are you learning anything exciting? Her tone made my blood boil, but I forced myself to play along. It's good, I lied. Busy though. What about you? How was Sandra's? There was the smallest pause, but it was enough to make my heart race. Oh, it was nice, she said. We just stayed in, had some wine, and watched a rom-com. Nothing special. The audacity of her lie left me speechless for a moment. I wanted to scream, to ask her how she could look me in the eye, or in this case, speak to me on the phone, and pretend everything was fine. But I kept my composure. That sounds relaxing, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You deserve a break with how hard you've been working. She laughed lightly. Yeah, Jake's been piling it on lately, but I don't mind. He's been really supportive. Hearing his name again sent a chill down my spine. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the phone. That's good, I managed to say. He seems close to you. She hesitated again, and I could almost hear her brain scrambling for the right response. Well, you know, he's my boss. We work closely together, so I guess we're kind of friends, too. But nothing weird or anything like that. Nothing weird. If only she knew what I had seen. After a few more minutes of polite small talk, I ended the call. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely set the phone down. I couldn't wrap my head around how easily she lied, how she didn't seem to have an ounce of guilt or remorse. But the worst part? A tiny piece of me still wanted to believe her. It's funny how the mind works. Even when you have the truth staring you in the face, there's a part of you that clings to the life you thought you had, the person you thought you knew. I realized then that confronting her wouldn't be enough. She was too good at covering her tracks, too good at playing the perfect wife. No, if I wanted the full truth, I needed to be patient. I needed to plan. After that call, I knew I couldn't sit still. Every nerve in my body screamed for action, but I also understood that blowing up right then wouldn't get me what I needed. Answers, clarity, closure. I had to stay in control, even if it felt impossible. The first thing I did was go back to the PI. I called him up, and we talked for nearly an hour. I asked him to dig deeper, to leave no stone unturned. I needed more than photos from one night. I needed to know the full extent of what Candy had been hiding. He promised he'd keep working on it and suggested I check any shared accounts or devices we had at home. He said it might help me get ahead of her if she was using apps or making plans I didn't know about. The moment I hung up, I remembered something: Candy's tablet. She barely used it anymore, but she'd set it up to sync with her phone. It was mostly for work stuff, or so she said, but now I wondered if it held more. When I got back from my trip, I made sure to arrive earlier than I'd told Candy. I wanted time to look through that tablet without her around. Luckily, she was still at work when I walked in the door. The house was eerily quiet, like it could sense the storm brewing. The tablet was in the usual spot, on the living room bookshelf. My hands shook as I picked it up and unlocked it. It was still synced to her usual password. I started with her messages. Most of it was harmless chatter with friends, but then I saw a conversation with Jake W. My stomach flipped. I opened it, and there it was, weeks of texts that confirmed what I'd feared. Jake, Friday night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you. Candy, you're such a bad influence. Winky face. But it was fun. Maybe too much fun. Can't let Tim find out, lol. The texts got worse from there. Plans to meet up, flirty exchanges, and even jokes about how sneaky they thought they were. My heart sank as I realized the truth wasn't just in those photos. It was right here in black and white. I also found a message thread between Candy and a coworker named Lauren. At first, it seemed innocent, work-related stuff, a few jokes, but then Lauren asked, "Does Tim suspect anything?" Candy's reply felt like a dagger to the chest. Not a clue. He's so busy with work, he doesn't notice anything. We're good. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring. It wasn't just Jake. Other people knew. They knew and said nothing while I went about my life, clueless and trusting. When I heard the front door open, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Candy was home. I barely had time to shut off the tablet and put it back before she walked into the room, all smiles and acting like nothing was wrong. "Hey, you're home early," she said, leaning in to kiss me. I turned my head at the last second, her lips brushing my cheek instead. Her smile faltered. "Everything okay?" I forced a tight smile. "Yeah, just tired from the trip. I think I'll head to bed early." As I walked upstairs, I could feel her eyes on me, questioning, suspicious. But she didn't say anything. I closed the bedroom door behind me, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the floor. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep up the act, but one thing was clear: Candy wasn't just lying to me. She was building an entire life behind my back, and I was finally starting to see it for what it was. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Candy, staring at the ceiling while my mind raced. Every time she shifted or let out a soft breath, I felt a wave of disgust. How could she sleep so soundly while I was unraveling inside? The next morning, she acted like nothing had changed. She kissed me goodbye before heading to work, and I managed to keep my composure long enough to say, "Have a good day." The second the door closed behind her, I was back on the tablet. I needed more. This time, I checked her email. Most of it was work-related, but there were a few emails between her and Jake that stood out. They were careful, never too explicit, but it was clear they were planning more than meetings and presentations. One subject line caught my eye: "Friday, are you still in?" I opened it. Jake had written, "The house is ready. Bring whatever you want to drink, and don't worry about staying late. No one's going to say anything." Candy's reply was even more casual: "You know I'm in, winky face. Can't wait." The date on the email matched the night she was supposedly at Sandra's. I felt my stomach churn as I realized they were talking about the party. But then I noticed something even worse. The email wasn't just to Candy. It was a group email. There were at least 6 other people included. I scanned the names, recognizing a few coworkers she'd mentioned before. But one name stood out: Lauren, the same coworker who had texted her asking if I suspected anything. I sat back, my heart pounding. This wasn't just some secret fling. This was an entire circle of people enabling her. They knew, and they were covering for her. At that moment, my phone buzzed. It was the PI. "I have more for you," he said when I answered. "And you need to see it in person." I agreed to meet him at his office that afternoon. I didn't want Candy to catch on, so I left the house early, telling her I had errands to run. She didn't seem suspicious, just gave me her usual smile and a "love you" as I walked out the door. By the time I got to the PI's office, my nerves were shot. He handed me a folder as soon as I walked in. "This is from a few nights ago," he said. "It's worse than what I sent before." I opened the folder, and my breath caught in my throat. The photos showed Candy at another party. This time, it wasn't just Jake. There were other men, and the scenes were far more explicit. It was clear this wasn't a one-time thing or even a simple affair. The PI's voice cut through my haze. "This wasn't just a party," he said. "It was more like a lifestyle. Jake hosts these regularly. Your wife seems to be a regular participant." My head spun. A lifestyle? I couldn't wrap my mind around it. This wasn't the Candy I knew, or thought I knew. I slammed the folder shut, unable to look at the photos anymore. "What now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's up to you," he said. "But you need to be careful. If you confront her without a plan, it could backfire." He was right, but I didn't know how much longer I could keep this bottled up. I thanked him and left, the folder clutched tightly in my hands. Driving home, I kept thinking about all the pieces I'd uncovered: her lies, her texts, the photos, the emails. I wasn't just dealing with betrayal anymore. I was dealing with a completely different version of my wife, one I didn't recognize. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep digging or just let it all burn. When I got home, Candy was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she prepped dinner. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the air, but I couldn't appreciate it. All I could think about was the folder sitting in my car, the truth of who she really was waiting for me just outside that door. "Hey, you're back early," she said with a warm smile. "How'd your errands go?" "They were fine," I said, my voice more clipped than I intended. Her smile faltered for a moment before she turned back to the cutting board. "I'm making your favorite tonight, pasta primavera." I forced a smile. Sounds great. But it wasn't great. Nothing was. Sitting at that table, watching her act so normal, so loving, made my skin crawl. I couldn't stop wondering how long she'd been playing this part, how many nights like this she'd sat across from me after lying to my face. As she poured me a glass of wine, I noticed her phone on the counter. Normally, she'd never leave it out like that. It was always in her pocket or flipped screen down if it was nearby. But tonight, she seemed relaxed, careless even. An idea crept into my mind. While she was distracted by the stove, I reached over and casually tapped her phone. It lit up, and a flood of notifications appeared. Messages from Lauren, Jake, and a few numbers I didn't recognize. I only caught a glimpse before the screen went dark again, but it was enough to confirm what I already knew. "Everything okay?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. "Yeah," I said quickly, pulling my hand back. Just checking the time. Dinner was a blur. She talked about her day, the usual office gossip, while I barely said a word. I could feel the tension building in my chest, the anger simmering just below the surface. By the time we finished eating, I felt like I was going to explode. "You've been quiet tonight," she said as she started clearing the plates. "Is something on your mind?" The way she looked at me, concerned, almost loving, made my stomach turn. I wanted to yell, to throw those photos in her face and demand answers. But I knew it wasn't the right time. "Not yet. I'm just tired," I said, forcing a yawn. The trip took more out of me than I thought. She nodded, her expression softening. "Why don't you head to bed early? I'll clean up." I mumbled my thanks and went upstairs, but instead of going to bed, I grabbed the folder from my car and locked myself in the guest room. I spread everything out on the bed, the photos, the emails, the notes from the PI. Looking at it all together, the picture was clear. Candy wasn't just unfaithful, she was living a double life. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. The evidence was right here, and there was no denying it. Now, I just needed to figure out what to do next. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd aged a decade overnight. The weight of everything I'd discovered was crushing, but I couldn't afford to fall apart. Not yet. I needed to focus, to stay sharp, and figure out how to handle this without letting Candy manipulate the situation. As I sat in the guest room, staring at the pile of evidence on the bed, an idea began to form. Confronting her outright wouldn't work. She'd lie, twist the story, maybe even turn it around on me. No, I needed her to admit to it herself, and I needed proof. That meant setting a trap. I went downstairs, acting as normal as I could, and found Candy in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone while sipping her coffee. She looked up when I walked in and gave me that same smile I'd fallen in love with years ago. It was hard to believe how fake it felt now. "Morning," she said. "Feeling better today?" "Yeah, I think I just needed some rest," I lied, pouring myself a cup of coffee. She leaned against the counter, watching me. "You seemed really stressed last night. If there's something bothering you, you can tell me, you know." The irony of her saying that almost made me laugh. But I kept my face neutral. "I know," I said. "Just work stuff, nothing serious." For the next hour, I acted like everything was fine. I helped her with the laundry, chatted about random things, even complimented her on the dinner from the night before. If she suspected anything, she didn't show it. Once she left for work, I got to work on my plan. First, I set up a voice recorder in the living room, hidden behind a stack of books on the shelf. Then I placed a small camera in the corner of the kitchen, angled to capture the table and counter where she usually hung out when she got home. I wasn't proud of spying on her in my own house, but after everything I'd seen, I didn't feel like I had much of a choice. By the time I finished, my nerves were shot. I spent the rest of the day pacing, replaying every conversation we'd had in my head, looking for clues I might have missed. When Candy came home that evening, she was in a good mood, chatting about her day and making plans for the weekend. "Sandra wants to have another girls' night soon," she said, her tone casual. I forced a smile. "Sounds fun. When were you thinking?" "Not sure yet," she said, brushing it off. "I'll let you know." Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it quickly before setting it face down on the counter. I didn't need to ask who it was. Later that night, while she was in the shower, I checked the voice recorder. There wasn't much, just the normal sounds of her moving around the house. But then I heard her talking on the phone. "I can't wait to see you again," she said, her voice soft. "I'll figure something out, don't worry." My stomach dropped. It wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm she was still actively seeing Jake, or worse, someone else entirely. As I sat there, listening to her lies in my own home, a dark resolve started to form. She thought she could keep this up, that she was untouchable. But she was wrong. The trap was set, and it was only a matter of time before she walked right into it. The next day, I woke up feeling oddly calm, like my mind had shifted into autopilot. Everything Candy said and did felt like part of some twisted performance, and I was just a silent audience member, waiting for the curtain to fall. Over breakfast, she seemed more chipper than usual. I've been thinking, she said, buttering her toast. We should plan a little getaway soon. Just the two of us. It's been a while since we did something romantic. Romantic. The word felt like a slap in the face, but I managed to keep my expression neutral. That sounds nice, I said. Where were you thinking? I don't know, maybe a cabin in the mountains? Somewhere cozy where we can just relax and reconnect. Reconnecting was the last thing on my mind, but I nodded like it was a great idea. Let's look into it this weekend. She smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. I love you, Tim. Hearing those words from her felt like nails on a chalkboard. I fought the urge to pull my hand away and instead squeezed back lightly. Love you too. When she left for work, I checked the camera footage from the night before. I was hoping to catch her texting Jake or calling him again, but all I got was her scrolling through her phone and watching TV. Still, I knew better than to think she'd suddenly changed her ways. Later that afternoon, I decided to take things a step further. I called Lauren. Her number was easy to find. It was on a group text Candy had once forwarded me months ago, back when I still thought their office drama was funny. When Lauren picked up, her voice was cautious. Hello? Hi, Lauren, I said, keeping my tone polite. This is Tim, Candy's husband. I was wondering if you had a moment to talk. There was a pause, then a nervous laugh. Sure. What's this about? I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. I've been feeling like Candy's been distant lately. I know you two are close, so I thought maybe you could help me figure out what's going on. Another pause. Distant? I mean, she's been busy with work. Jake's been putting a lot on her plate. The mention of Jake made my blood boil, but I kept my voice steady. Yeah, I've heard about that. Do you think there's more to it than just work? Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. I don't know what you mean, she stammered. Lauren, I said, lowering my voice, I know about the party. There it was, the sound of her breath catching. I don't know what you're talking about, she said quickly. I have to go. Wait, I said before she could hang up. I'm not mad at you. I just need to know the truth. She didn't respond, and after a long pause, the line went dead. I stared at my phone, frustration bubbling up inside me. Lauren wasn't going to crack, but her reaction told me everything I needed to know. Candy's web of lies was bigger than I'd imagined, and I was done playing along. It was time to push things further. After Lauren hung up on me, I sat there staring at my phone, debating my next move. I hadn't expected her to spill everything right away, but her reaction made one thing clear: she knew something, and she was scared. That fear could work in my favor. I decided to bide my time and focus on Candy instead. That evening, when she came home, I noticed she was more affectionate than usual. She greeted me with a kiss, cooked dinner again, and even suggested we watch one of my favorite movies together. At first, I thought she might suspect something, but then I realized it was guilt. She was trying to act like the perfect wife to cover up her double life. During the movie, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at it and quickly flipped it over, but not before I caught a glimpse of the name on the screen, Jake. My stomach clenched. I forced myself to stay calm and waited until she went to the bathroom before picking up her phone. It was locked, of course, but I noticed the preview of a new message. Friday night, my place. Can't wait to see you. My hands shook as I set the phone back down. She was still seeing him, still lying to my face. When she came back, I pretended nothing was wrong, but my mind was already spinning. I needed to make her feel safe, like I hadn't caught on, so she'd keep letting her guard down. The next day, I put my plan into action. I called Lauren again. This time, I left her a voicemail. Lauren, it's Tim. Look, I know you're in a tough spot, but I need your help. Candy's lying to me, and I just want the truth. If you don't want to talk on the phone, maybe we can meet in person. I promise I'm not looking to hurt anyone, I just need answers. To my surprise, she called back an hour later. Her voice was shaky, but she agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near her office after work. When I arrived, Lauren was already there, nervously stirring a cup of tea. She looked up as I approached, her eyes darting around the room like she expected Candy to walk in at any moment. Thanks for meeting me, I said, sitting down across from her. I don't know why I'm here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to get involved in whatever this is. You're already involved, I said gently. You've been covering for her, haven't you? Her face paled, and she looked down at her tea. "I didn't mean to," she muttered. "She's my friend. I didn't want to betray her." "And what about me?" I asked. "Don't I deserve to know the truth?" Lauren hesitated, biting her lip. Finally, she sighed. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," I said. For the next half hour, Lauren spilled everything she knew. She told me about the parties, about Candy's relationship with Jake, and about how their entire office was practically in on it. "She always said it wasn't serious," Lauren said, her voice trembling. "She said she loved you and that it didn't mean anything." I clenched my fists under the table. "And you believed her?" "I didn't know what to believe," she admitted. "But I think she's in over her head. Jake's not a good guy, Tim. He has a reputation for this kind of thing." That hit me like a ton of bricks. Candy wasn't just cheating. She was being manipulated by a man who had probably done this to countless others. Lauren looked at me, guilt written all over her face. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have said something sooner." I nodded, my mind racing. "Thank you," I said. "You've helped more than you know." As I left the coffee shop, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, betrayal, and something I hadn't expected, pity. But pity wouldn't stop me from doing what I needed to do. Candy's lies were unraveling, and soon, there'd be nowhere left for her to hide. After my conversation with Lauren, the pieces of Candy's secret life began falling into place. I now had everything I needed: proof of her lies, her affair with Jake, and her involvement in something much bigger than a simple fling. The only thing left was to confront her. But not yet. I needed her to feel comfortable, to believe I was none the wiser. Only then would she drop her guard completely. The following day, I played my part perfectly. Over breakfast, I brought up her idea about a getaway. "I've been thinking about the cabin trip you mentioned," I said casually. "Maybe we should start planning it for next month." Her eyes lit up, and she smiled. "Really? I think that would be amazing. I'll look up a few places today." "Great," I said, forcing a smile. "We could both use the time away." I watched her carefully as she spoke, noting the way she relaxed, the way her smile seemed more genuine. She was buying it. Later that evening, I set my trap in motion. While she was in the shower, I slipped her phone off the counter and went straight to the text thread with Jake. I scrolled through their recent messages and found everything I needed: plans for their next meeting, details about another party, and even an exchange where Jake joked about how clueless I was. I forwarded the messages to myself, deleting the evidence of the forward, and put the phone back where I found it just as she stepped out of the bathroom. "You look tense," she said, wrapping herself in a towel. "Long day." "Yeah," I said, rubbing my neck. "Just a lot of work stuff." She came over and kissed my cheek. "You should relax. I'll make some tea." As she disappeared downstairs, I stood there, staring at the spot where her phone had been. It was amazing how easily she could switch between roles. Devoted wife one moment, reckless adulterer the next. That night, I reviewed the messages I'd forwarded to myself, piecing together her schedule and her plans with Jake. She was supposed to meet him Friday night at his place, the same night I conveniently had plans to work late. I decided to let her think she was in the clear. I even went so far as to tell her about my made-up work obligation. "I'll probably be home late Friday," I said casually over dinner. "We've got a big project wrapping up." She barely looked up from her plate. "No problem. I'll probably just have a quiet night in." The lies came so easily to her, it was almost impressive. Almost. By Friday, everything was in place. I had the PI on standby to follow her to Jake's house, and I had my own plan for when the time came. That evening, I kissed her goodbye as I left for work, and she gave me a sweet smile. "Don't work too hard," she said, as if she actually cared. As I drove away, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. She had no idea what was coming. The net was closing, and by the end of the night, Candy would finally face the truth she'd been running from. Friday night felt like it stretched on forever. After leaving the house, I parked my car a few blocks away and waited for Candy to leave. My hands were sweaty as I gripped the steering wheel, watching the minutes tick by. Finally, around 8:30, I saw her car pull out of the driveway. She was dressed to impress: heels, a sleek black dress, and more makeup than usual. My stomach churned as I thought about where she was headed and who she was trying to impress. I waited a minute before following her, keeping my distance so she wouldn't notice me. The PI was already stationed near Jake's house, ready to document everything. As I tailed her through the quiet streets, A part of me still hoped she'd turn around, that she'd decide to come home instead. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. Candy was too far gone, too comfortable in her lies to stop now. After about 20 minutes, she pulled into a long driveway leading up to a large modern house with bright lights spilling out of the windows. Jake's place. I parked down the street and called the PI. She just arrived, I said. I see her, he replied. I'll keep an eye on things. As I hung up, I felt a mix of anger and dread. Part of me wanted to storm in there, to confront her and Jake in front of everyone. But I knew that would be reckless. I needed to stick to the plan. For the next hour, I sat in my car, my mind racing. I thought about our wedding day, the promises we'd made to each other, the life we'd built together. How had it come to this? The PI called around 10 o'clock. Tim, I've got what you need, he said. She's with Jake. It's pretty explicit. I clenched my jaw, my grip tightening on the phone. Keep recording, I said. I want as much as you can get. Understood, he said. After we hung up, I stared at the house in the distance, my chest tight with rage. I could almost see them in my mind, laughing, touching, acting like I didn't exist. When the PI sent me a few photos, the reality hit even harder. There they were, sitting close on a couch, Jake's arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. It was intimate, casual, like they'd done this 100 times before. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to make them feel even a fraction of the pain they'd caused me. But instead, I took a deep breath and reminded myself why I was doing this. This wasn't just about anger or revenge. It was about taking back control of my life, about confronting the truth and finally putting an end to Candy's lies. By the time I drove home, I felt strangely calm. The PI would gather the rest of the evidence and deliver it to me in the morning. Then it would be time for Candy to face the consequences of her actions. The next morning, I woke up early, my mind racing with everything I needed to do. Candy was still asleep, curled up on her side of the bed like she didn't have a care in the world. The sight of her used to bring me peace. Now, it just made my stomach turn. I slipped out of bed quietly and made myself a cup of coffee, sitting at the kitchen table while I waited for the PI's call. My phone buzzed right on time, and I answered on the first ring. I've got everything, he said. Photos, videos, even audio from last night. It's all pretty damning. Send it to me, I said. My voice was steady, but inside, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. Within minutes, my email pinged with a folder of files. I opened it cautiously, bracing myself for what I already knew was there. The images and clips left no room for doubt. Candy and Jake were all over each other, laughing and kissing like teenagers. There were other people in the background, men and women, but it was clear Candy's focus was entirely on Jake. One video caught my attention in particular. In it, Jake joked about me. "Doesn't your husband ever get suspicious?" he asked, his tone dripping with arrogance. Candy laughed, twirling a strand of her hair. "Tim's too busy with work to notice anything. Besides, he trusts me." I felt my jaw clench so tightly it hurt. The casual cruelty of her words hit me harder than I'd expected. She didn't just betray me, she mocked me. I closed the laptop, my hands shaking. It was time. Candy wandered into the kitchen not long after, yawning and stretching. "Morning," she said, smiling like nothing was wrong. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from me, oblivious to the storm brewing. "What's the plan for today?" I stared at her for a moment, studying her face. Did she really think she could keep this up forever? That I'd never find out? "I thought we could talk," I said, setting my mug down. She frowned slightly, tilting her head. "About what?" I leaned back in my chair, keeping my gaze steady. "About us. About Jake." Her reaction was subtle but telling. Her eyes widened just a fraction before she quickly looked down at her coffee. "Jake," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "What about him?" The air between us felt thick, heavy with tension. "You're lying to me, Candy," I said quietly. "And I know everything." Her face paled, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. I pushed the folder across the table, the one containing all the evidence the PI had collected. "Go ahead," I said. "Take a look." She stared at the folder like it might bite her, her hands trembling as she reached for it. When she finally opened it and saw the photos, her face crumbled. "Tim, I can explain," she started, her voice shaking. No, I interrupted, my voice cold. You don't get to explain. You've been lying to me for months, years maybe. I trusted you, and you threw it all away. Tears welled up in her eyes as she tried to stammer out an apology, but I didn't want to hear it. Not yet. You need to pack a bag, I said, standing up. I want you out of this house by the end of the day. Her jaw dropped. Tim, please. I'm done, Candy, I said firmly. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving her sitting there with the evidence of her betrayal spread out in front of her. The confrontation wasn't over, but for now, I needed space. I locked myself in the guest room, pacing back and forth as I tried to calm my nerves. Downstairs, I could hear Candy crying, her muffled sobs tugging at the part of me that still remembered the woman I thought she was. But every time I felt the slightest pang of sympathy, I pictured those photos, those texts, the way she'd laughed at my trust. After about 30 minutes, there was a knock at the door. Tim, Candy's voice came through, shaky and hoarse. Please, can we talk? Just for a minute. I didn't answer right away, debating whether I even wanted to hear what she had to say. But part of me needed to know, why? How could she do this to me? I opened the door and stood there, arms crossed. What? She looked a mess, her makeup smeared from crying, her eyes red and swollen. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Sorry doesn't cut it, Candy, I said, my voice sharp. I need answers. She stepped inside hesitantly, wringing her hands. I never wanted this to happen, she started. Jake, he came on to me, and I didn't know how to say no. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Don't play the victim. You didn't accidentally end up at parties with him. You didn't accidentally send those texts or laugh about how clueless I was. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed. I made a mistake, Tim. I know I messed up, but I love you. I was just. I don't know, I was stupid and selfish and what? I interrupted. You thought you could have it all? A husband at home and a fling with your boss. Her silence was all the answer I needed. You need to leave, I said, my voice cold and final. Please, Tim, she begged, dropping to her knees. We can fix this. I'll quit my job, I'll go to counseling, whatever it takes. Just give me one more chance. I stared down at her, my chest tight with anger and grief. You didn't just betray me, Candy. You destroyed everything we built together. How do you come back from that? She reached for my hand, but I stepped back, shaking my head. You should have thought about that before you went to Jake's house last night. Before you lied to my face over and over again. Her face crumpled, and she buried it in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. I stood there, unmoving, feeling nothing but the weight of her betrayal. Pack your things, I said quietly. I'll give you until tonight to figure out where you're going. But you're not staying here. She didn't argue this time, just nodded weakly. As I left the room, I heard her whisper, I'm so sorry, Tim, over and over again. But sorry wasn't enough. Not anymore. Candy spent the rest of the day packing in silence. I stayed out of her way, keeping to the guest room and trying to process everything that had happened. Part of me wanted to break down, to scream, cry, anything to let out the anger and pain. But I felt numb, like my emotions had been drained dry. Around 5 p.m., she came to the door, a small suitcase in her hand. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, though it had only been hours since I confronted her. I'm ready, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, standing up. Do you have somewhere to go? She hesitated before answering. I'll stay with a friend for now. Sandra said I could crash with her. Sandra. The same friend she'd used as a cover for her lies. I wanted to laugh at the irony, but I didn't have the energy. We walked to the front door together, the silence between us heavy and suffocating. When we reached the threshold, she turned to face me, her eyes brimming with tears. Tim, she said, her voice trembling, I know I don't deserve it, but I just need you to know how sorry I am. I was selfish, and I ruined everything. I'll never forgive myself for what I did to you. I stared at her, searching for any trace of the woman I thought I knew. You're right, I said after a long pause. You don't deserve my forgiveness. But maybe someday, I'll find a way to let this go, for my sake, not yours. She flinched at my words, her tears spilling over. I love you, she whispered. I shook my head, my voice steady but firm. If you loved me, Candy, you wouldn't have done this. Love isn't just words, it's actions. And your actions speak louder than anything you can say right now. She looked like she wanted to say something else, but instead, she nodded and stepped out onto the porch. I watched as she walked to her car, her head bowed like a prisoner being led away. When she drove off, I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty driveway. The house felt eerily quiet without her, the kind of silence that presses down on you like a weight. I closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. It was over. The marriage, the lies, the betrayal, it was all behind me now. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The first night without Candy was the hardest. The house felt too big, too empty. Every corner of it reminded me of her, the smell of her perfume in the bedroom, the half-empty bottle of wine she'd left on the kitchen counter, the blanket she always wrapped herself in while watching TV. I barely slept. My mind replayed everything, her lies, the photos, her hollow apologies. I kept asking myself how I'd missed the signs, how I'd let things get so far without realizing what was happening. The next morning, I made myself get up and face the day. The alternative was letting her betrayal consume me, and I wasn't willing to give her that power. I spent the day clearing out the house, packing up her things, scrubbing away the evidence of the life we'd shared. Every item I boxed up felt like shedding a layer of dead skin. Her clothes, her makeup, the silly knickknacks she'd insisted on keeping, all of it went into bags and boxes, waiting for her to collect later. By the time I finished, the house didn't feel so suffocating anymore. It felt like mine again. I didn't tell anyone right away, but eventually, the news started to trickle out. Friends and family were shocked, of course. My mom cried when I told her. My best friend, David, wanted to handle Jake, but I told him it wasn't worth it. People asked if I was okay, and I gave them the same answer every time: I will be. And I meant it. A few weeks later, I met with my lawyer to finalize the divorce. Candy hadn't fought me on anything, which surprised me. She'd signed the papers without a word, and I didn't even have to ask her to leave the house. Maybe she thought it was the least she could do after everything. The last I heard, she quit her job and moved in with her parents. Jake, apparently, had already moved on to someone else. The thought gave me a bitter kind of satisfaction. As for me, I've been taking things one day at a time. Therapy has helped, giving me a space to unpack the anger, the hurt, the loss. I've started reconnecting with old friends, picking up hobbies I'd let fall by the wayside. Slowly but surely, I'm rebuilding. There are moments when it still hits me, like when I hear a song we used to love or pass a place we used to go together. The grief comes in waves, but it's not as overwhelming as it used to be. People tell me I'll find love again someday, and maybe they're right. But for now, I'm focused on loving myself and building a life that feels whole, even without her in it. Candy once told me I was her rock, the steady presence that kept her grounded. I used to take pride in that. But now, I realize I don't need to be anyone's rock. I just need to be my own. And that's my story. I don't know if it's over yet, but this chapter definitely is. If you've ever gone through something like this, I hope you know you're not alone. It hurts like hell, but you can survive it. I'm living proof. Thanks for reading.